He had his ticket. He had his seat assignment. He even had the stripes that marked 3 decades of service across 2 continents. But when the gate agent looked up and saw him, really saw him, everything changed. "I'm sorry, sir. There's been a change in your seating arrangement." That's what she said. No explanation, no apology, just a tone that made it clear his presence didn't belong where his boarding pass said he should be. Behind him, a white businessman who had just checked in without a word was ushered forward. There was no confusion, no mix-up. This wasn't about paperwork, it was about something else entirely, and someone nearby was recording. The video didn't need captions. The look on the man's face said everything. He wasn't angry, he wasn't begging, he simply wanted an answer. And what happened next didn't just shake the passengers in that terminal, it put an entire airline under fire. If you're watching this right now, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single story like this. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We see you, and your voice matters. Malcolm Reeves was a quiet man. Decorated, yes, but more known for how he treated people than for the rows of medals on his chest. 34 years in service, first with the RAF, later with the US Air Force. 2 tours in Afghanistan, NATO leadership, peacekeeping in the Balkans. He'd seen war, but carried himself like someone who had made peace with it. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, and he never chased recognition. That morning, he packed light. 1 duffel, a folded letter, and a suit he hadn't worn in years. Not for ceremony, not for honor, but because the woman who raised him, the one he hadn't seen in almost 6 years, was slipping away in a hospital bed in London. The doctors had called 2 nights earlier. There wasn't much time left. He booked the earliest first-class flight out of JFK, non-stop to Heathrow. It was expensive. He didn't care. His mother had always told him, when it matters, you show up, and you show up right. Malcolm never made scenes, never demanded anything. He showed up early, greeted the desk staff with a smile, and answered with a firm, "Yes, ma'am," when the TSA agent waved him through pre-check. Nothing about his appearance suggested trouble, but something about him, or more precisely, the color of his skin, still triggered a different reaction. He noticed it before he even reached the gate. A shift in posture, a narrowing of eyes, that polite but sharp edge black travelers know all too well. The way suspicion walks just ahead of you, waiting to pounce on the smallest reason. But Malcolm pushed those thoughts aside. He'd lived through worse. He'd flown in and out of combat zones. A civilian flight couldn't rattle him. At least that's what he believed. As he stood by the gate, waiting for the pre-board announcement, a white man in business attire strode past and nodded toward the first-class sign. The gate agent greeted him warmly, even laughed at something he said. When Malcolm stepped forward minutes later, same zone, same boarding group, her smile vanished. She scanned his ticket, paused, looked up, then looked again as if the seat number was a mistake. That was the moment. Her voice didn't rise, her expression didn't change much, but it only took 6 words to set everything in motion. "There's been a change, sir." No explanation, just that. A pause stretched between them, the kind of pause that drips with unspoken messages. Malcolm responded the only way he knew how, with measured calm. "My ticket says 2A. Is there a problem with that seat?" The agent didn't look him in the eye. Her fingers tapped the keyboard like it owed her something. She leaned in to whisper to a colleague, then turned back with a face that said, this was over. "You'll be seated in economy, row 34. Around him, passengers were watching, some with confusion, others with disinterest. But one woman holding her phone at waist level had already started recording. Malcolm stood still, his hands relaxed, his jaw tight. He wasn't just being denied a seat. He was being told, without a single racial slur, exactly where the airline thought he belonged. The woman holding the phone kept her lens steady, instinctively aware that something wasn't right. Malcolm, however, wasn't performing for the camera. He didn't know it was recording. He was focused on the gate agent, on trying to understand why his confirmed seat had been revoked without reason. "May I speak to a supervisor?" His voice was low, not angry, just firm. But instead, the gate agent turned to her screen and muttered something that sounded like protocol, not courtesy. "Sir, your behavior is becoming disruptive. I'm going to ask you to step aside." Malcolm looked her straight in the eye. "What behavior?" The agent didn't answer. A uniformed airline security officer approached, then another. They stood on either side of him like he'd triggered an alarm. "Sir, this is your last warning," one said. The woman behind the phone could be heard whispering, "Why are they surrounding him?" He didn't even raise his voice. Malcolm's boarding pass was still in his hand. Seat 2A, printed clear as day. He held it out to the officer. "This is my seat. That's my name. What's the issue?" The officer didn't look at the pass. Instead, he motioned to the gate. "We need you to step away from the boarding area. Now." That word, need, was used like a shield. A deflection. No explanation, no policy reference. Just a soft command backed by the quiet threat of escalation. Passengers started filming. One whispered, "He's a veteran. You can tell by the stripes." Another murmured, "They'd never treat a white man like this." Malcolm didn't move. He didn't shout. But every second that passed chipped away at his dignity. Not because he needed to be in first class, but because he'd paid for it, followed every rule, and was still being pushed aside as if his presence were offensive. And then came the sentence that sealed the moment. "We reserve the right to reassign any seat at any time, sir." He blinked. That was the answer? The woman recording let out a stunned breath. The man next to her muttered, "No way. This is discrimination, straight up." Malcolm turned, slowly walking away from the gate without a word. Not because he was giving up, but because he understood what was happening. And more importantly, he understood who was watching now. As he reached the waiting area, his phone buzzed. A stranger had already tagged him on Twitter. The video was online, 20 seconds long, 10,000 views, in less than 5 minutes. The comment section was flooding. Why was this black veteran treated like a threat? He was calm the entire time. What disruption? I hope this goes viral. People need to see this. The clip was just under 20 seconds. Shaky, recorded from waist level, muffled by airport chatter. But what it showed didn't need context. A black man in uniform quietly insisting on his confirmed seat, a gate agent refusing eye contact, security forming a wall, no raised voices, no aggression, just a scene that spoke volumes. By the time Malcolm sat down near gate 34, unaware the footage had already been posted, the internet was doing what it does best, catching fire. The first post came from Kayla Harper, a college student from Boston connecting through JFK. She hadn't meant to become a whistleblower, but the moment she saw the interaction, she knew it wasn't right. Just watched a black veteran get his first-class seat snatched without cause. Calm. Respectful, denied anyway. Why? His face? At Air Nova Airlines, we're watching. Justice for Malcolm. She attached the video. 17 retweets in the first minute. By the third minute, it had crossed state lines. By the fifth, it was on the front page of Black Twitter. Other passengers chimed in. I was there. He was nothing but respectful. They surrounded him like he was dangerous. He had his seat. This is disgusting. Dude had his military jacket on. Guess even medals don't stop you from getting profiled at the gate. A popular influencer reposted it to her 2 million followers with one line, "This is why we record everything." Within 20 minutes, hashtags exploded. Justice for Malcolm. Seat 34 is not an upgrade. Air Nova disgrace. Major pages picked it up. Comment sections filled with rage, stories, and heartbreak. Some remembered family members in uniform who faced similar moments of public disrespect. Others were veterans themselves, hurt but not surprised. The video was now making rounds on news sites. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. No context needed. The image of a black man in uniform being stripped of dignity was enough. Meanwhile, Malcolm sat in economy, staring out the window, unaware of the storm building outside. He didn't post a word. Didn't know the clip existed yet. But others were speaking for him now, and they weren't whispering. At Air Nova's headquarters, the communications team was caught off guard. Their phones began buzzing. Emails flooded, press inquiries stacked. Someone tried to draft a standard response. We are aware of an incident involving a passenger and are currently reviewing internal procedures. But before they could even tweet it, the backlash had outpaced them. News anchors asked, was this racially motivated? Panelists debated the fine print on airline seating policies. Civil rights groups issued public statements within the hour. Back in the airport, Kayla walked past Malcolm's new seat. She glanced at him, still seated, still silent, staring ahead like nothing happened. She almost didn't say anything, but stopped. Sir, I'm sorry, you didn't deserve that." He looked at her and nodded once, a tired, small smile. "Thank you." He still didn't know that his quiet refusal to argue had triggered a nationwide outcry. By the time Malcolm's flight landed at Heathrow, the story had taken on a life of its own. What began as a quietly recorded moment of racial injustice had erupted into a global headline. He stepped off the plane to a flood of missed calls, blinking notifications, and a silence that hung heavy in his chest. He had no idea why his name was suddenly everywhere. But everyone else did. Air Nova's official statement came out 6 hours after the incident. "We are currently investigating a seating issue on Flight 272. We apologize for any inconvenience caused to our passengers and remain committed to inclusivity and respect across all our services." It was cold, sterile. No mention of the uniform, the demotion to coach, or the racial undertone of being dismissed without cause. The internet wasn't having it. Seating issue? Call it what it is. Racial profiling. A black war hero gets bumped with no explanation, and this is your apology? This is why we keep receipts. This is why we film. Within 24 hours, the video had over 12 million views. Veterans groups issued joint statements condemning the airline. One former Air Force colonel tweeted, "He's worn that uniform longer than most of your execs have held a job. He deserved better." We all do. A movement was forming, not just about one man, but about how easily black bodies are dismissed in public spaces, regardless of status or dignity. Cable news brought it into living rooms across the country. Networks replayed the video alongside panel discussions on racial bias in travel. Civil rights lawyers were interviewed. Think tanks rolled out statistics. The tone was clear. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern. Meanwhile, passengers who had flown with Air Nova began sharing similar experiences. "They told me my seat was double booked. Funny how the person who got it wasn't the one who looked like me. Upgraded. Never happened. Until my white coworker used my points and got first class instantly." An anonymous employee within the airline's customer relations department leaked internal memos. One line caught the public's attention. "Flagged passengers requiring reassignment. Group C1 appearance exceptions." What did that mean? No one at Air Nova would say. But the speculation was damning and believable. Pressure mounted. Sponsors began to pull advertising. Black travel influencers launched a campaign under the banner, "Fly Fair or Fly Elsewhere." Thousands signed a petition calling for a public apology and independent investigation. The airline's PR team tried damage control, highlighting their diversity initiatives, posting stock photos of smiling black flight attendants. But the audience wasn't fooled. Tokenism wasn't going to erase the humiliation seen across millions of screens. Back in London, Malcolm stayed mostly quiet. He gave no interviews, answered no reporters. All he wanted was to see his mother. But even in his silence, he had become a symbol of grace under pressure, of dignity ignored, of how deeply ingrained racism can be in even the most mundane moments. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations were lining up. A legal team reached out, not just to sue for compensation, but to use his case to push for sweeping industry reforms. The media storm didn't end in 24 hours. It deepened. Because this time, people weren't just watching. They were ready to act. And as whistleblowers stepped forward and internal documents surfaced, it became clear this wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of a reckoning. At Air Nova's headquarters, the walls were starting to sweat. Boardroom monitors displayed trending graphs that all pointed in the same direction, downward. Social sentiment was at an all-time low. Their stock had already dipped 4% overnight, $140 million lost in a day. Dozens of flight cancellations followed as calls flooded customer service lines, many of them saying the same 3 words, "never flying again." But numbers weren't the biggest problem. The bigger issue sat in the inbox of the airline's legal team, an anonymous email titled, "You can't hide this anymore." Attached were internal documents, emails between senior operations staff, training materials from the seating department, red flag memos that painted a pattern, not a one-time event. One email, dated 3 months prior, read, "Let's avoid optics on priority boarding. Last time we had too many of Group C in business. It created noise from legacy passengers." Group C, the same internal classification from the leaked reassignment list. Group C wasn't a travel tier. It was a silent code for passengers who didn't reflect the brand image. The problem? A large portion of those passengers were black, brown, or wore cultural or religious clothing. The document leak made its way to journalists within hours. Independent investigators verified the metadata, traced the authors, confirmed the timeline. There was no spinning it now. The airline had an internal culture that quietly tolerated and in some cases encouraged appearance-based seat reassignments. The executive team entered full crisis mode. PR heads scrambled. Lawyers reviewed old complaints that had been previously dismissed or resolved internally. Quiet settlements, confidentiality clauses. The truth had been buried, until now. The CEO, Elliot Granger, a polished man with a background in marketing, attempted to do damage control on national television. He sat on a morning news panel, clasping his hands tightly as he read from a script. "We deeply regret the situation that unfolded with Mr. Reeves. It does not reflect the values of our airline, and we are taking this very seriously." But his expression didn't match the gravity of the situation. His tone was stiff, disconnected. The backlash doubled. Clips of his interview circulated with brutal speed. "So you regret getting caught, not what you've been doing." No accountability, no suspension, no truth, just rehearsed damage control. Then came the next blow. Another whistleblower, this time a former gate agent, spoke anonymously to an investigative podcast. "There's an unofficial system. You learn quickly who they want up front and who's better off in the back. It's not on paper, but it's real." She spoke about being reprimanded for assigning first-class seats to passengers outside the image, especially on international routes. She had names, shift logs, and call recordings. Her testimony triggered a chain reaction. 2 more employees stepped forward, then 5, then 10. Some still on payroll, others long gone, all telling the same story, that Malcolm Reeves wasn't the first to be bumped. He was just the one the world saw. And now, the airline couldn't contain it. Behind closed doors, executives argued over who knew what and when. One VP resigned, another was placed on immediate leave. Internal leadership fractured. Investors began asking pointed questions, not about PR, about liability. The very infrastructure of the airline's upper management was now cracking under the weight of its own silence. And Malcolm Reeves? He still hadn't said a single word to the press. But the story he never asked to be part of had already begun reshaping an industry built on exclusion, masked as policy. The world knew him as the man in the viral video, the calm veteran in uniform who was forced to give up his seat. But that wasn't all Malcolm Reeves was. He was born in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1962, a time and place where survival meant learning to be twice as good for half the respect. His father had been a postal worker who never missed a shift, and his mother, a retired nurse, raised Malcolm and his younger brother with quiet strength and iron discipline. He joined the Royal Air Force at 18, part of a UK-US exchange program. From there, he served with distinction in both NATO peacekeeping and US coalition operations. He'd seen countries torn apart by prejudice. But what always stunned him was how easily that same prejudice was denied back home, how it wore a suit and smiled through policy. He never liked attention. The only time he stood in front of cameras was during a burial ceremony for a fellow officer, another black man who died in service and still had to fight for benefits after death. Malcolm had spoken that day, not from anger, but from exhaustion. "We give everything, and still we are asked to prove we belong." He had earned respect in places where it had nearly cost him his life. He had sat at briefing tables with generals, advised foreign ministers, and coordinated cross-border evacuations under pressure most civilians would never understand. Yet on that day in JFK, all of that disappeared. Because none of it could shield him from how some people still viewed a black man in a space they believed wasn't meant for him. He had been flying first class for years, never expected red carpet, never asked for handshakes. But he could always tell by the way eyes lingered on him, by the unspoken questions in white passengers' expressions. Is he supposed to be here? The flight where he was removed wasn't his first experience with this kind of silent hostility. It was just the first time someone caught it on camera. He'd spent a lifetime controlling how he reacted in public, because black men, especially ones in uniform, didn't get the luxury of righteous anger. Dignity was not a shield, it was a burden. You had to wear it carefully, or they'd call it arrogance. You had to stay calm, or they'd call it a threat. And even now, with the world buzzing around him, Malcolm stayed quiet. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew the value of silence. Silence makes people uncomfortable. It forces them to fill in the blanks. It puts the mirror up without saying a word. He spent his days at the hospital with his mother, whose voice had grown softer but still carried the same weight. "You showed them who you are, son. You didn't lose anything. They did." She'd watched the video, though he'd never planned to show her. She already knew the truth. She'd seen it her whole life. He didn't want to be anyone's symbol. He didn't want to lead a movement. But now, the world had placed him at the center of one. And while Malcolm Reeves hadn't spoken publicly yet, his silence had already stirred something far louder than words. Because behind the uniform wasn't just a soldier. 2 days after the incident, a press conference was called. Not by Malcolm Reeves, but by a coalition of civil rights attorneys representing him pro bono. They stood shoulder to shoulder behind a single microphone, in front of a wall of flashing cameras. The lead attorney, an older black woman with silver braids and courtroom fire in her voice, spoke clearly. What happened to Colonel Reeves was not a mistake. It was discrimination. We are pursuing legal action not just for him, but for every passenger who has been silently pushed to the back because of how they look. The class action lawsuit was filed that afternoon. It named Air Nova and its executive leadership directly, citing racial discrimination, emotional distress, violation of passenger rights, and patterns of exclusion based on appearance. The complaint included testimonies from current and former employees, internal emails already verified by independent investigators, and a list of over 70 passengers who had reached out with nearly identical stories. Air Nova tried to spin it as a miscommunication, urging the public to wait for full context. But context had already arrived, in the form of screenshots, audio recordings, and data showing that passengers of color were disproportionately reassigned from premium cabins to economy on over a dozen flagged routes. A viral clip of a retired Navy commander refusing to board an Air Nova flight spread quickly. He stood at the gate, camera rolling, and said, "If Colonel Reeves can be bumped to the back of the plane after giving this country his life, then none of us are safe from that same treatment." Boycotts grew. Protesters gathered outside major airports in Atlanta, Dallas, and Chicago, holding signs that read, "Uniforms deserve respect, not reassignment. If he can be denied, so can you." Within a week, Air Nova lost several major corporate contracts. A tech conglomerate pulled its travel agreement. A veterans organization withdrew funding for their military appreciation campaign. Even airport lounges stopped promoting Air Nova's premium service. The financial loss crossed $140 million in projected Q3 revenue. Still, Malcolm remained quiet. He hadn't spoken to the press, hadn't posted on social media. He attended legal meetings, sat through depositions, and visited his mother daily, never once asking for the attention that now flooded his life. But behind closed doors, he was listening. He listened to the mother who emailed saying her teenage son had been randomly reassigned from his seat next to her and placed at the back of the plane alone. He listened to the businesswoman who wrote, "Seeing you stand there so composed, it made me feel less alone. I've lost count of how many times I've been treated like baggage." He listened because he knew this wasn't just about one flight. It was about a system, a pattern. A wound reopened every time someone is reminded, without saying a word, that they don't belong. And now, that system was on trial. It started with a leak, an internal audit report buried deep within the company's archives. It had been conducted a year before Malcolm Reeves was denied his seat. The audit highlighted potential risk indicators in the airline's seating reassignment protocols. One line stood out. When the document surfaced, Air Nova's boardroom erupted. 2 high-ranking executives were immediately suspended. A third quietly resigned. The CEO, Elliot Granger, found himself under direct pressure from shareholders and investors. Not just because of the lawsuit, but because trust, once lost, doesn't return with a press release. The airline's largest shareholder, an investment firm known for progressive policies, issued a public statement calling for full restructuring of Air Nova's leadership and policies. The headline landed on major financial news outlets. Investors demand overhaul after racial discrimination crisis at Air Nova. That same day, Malcolm's legal team received a call. It wasn't an offer to settle. It was an invitation to consult on the airline's newly proposed anti-discrimination initiative. For a moment, it felt like a shift, an acknowledgement that real change might actually happen. But Malcolm wasn't interested in tokens. He reviewed the proposal. The promises sounded polished. But nowhere in the document was accountability named. Nowhere was there an admission of harm. He declined. Instead, he released a short, written statement. Policy without responsibility is performance. Until the people who allowed this to happen are removed, nothing meaningful can begin. The statement was shared over 1 million times in the first 12 hours. Pressure mounted. Airnova's crisis management team proposed a live apology broadcast nationwide. They believed a public face would soften the damage. Malcolm didn't attend. Instead, he focused on something else entirely. He launched a public registry, a digital platform where travelers could log and document discriminatory experiences across all airlines, not just Airnova. Within a week, over 3,000 cases were submitted. Some recent, some decades old, all disturbingly familiar. The registry became a tool for legal advocacy. Lawmakers referenced it during hearings. Journalists used it to build long-form investigations. Civil rights attorneys used it to establish patterns of abuse long denied by airline executives. The tipping point came when a second major airline was linked to similar practices. Internal documents, passenger testimonies, quiet upgrades for preferred profiles. The industry had been operating in shadows. Malcolm had unintentionally shined a light too bright to ignore. Facing an unprecedented wave of backlash, Airnova's board of directors voted to remove CEO Elliot Granger. A public announcement followed. Effective immediately, Mr. Granger has stepped down. We are committed to earning back the public's trust through action, transparency, and independent oversight. It wasn't just a PR move. It was the first time in the airline's history that leadership was removed due to discriminatory practices. Malcolm didn't celebrate. He was at his mother's bedside in London, holding her hand. The machines beeped softly in the background. Her breaths were slower now, her eyes distant. She turned to him, weak but clear, and whispered, "You didn't let them take your name. You gave them back their shame." She passed 2 hours later, peacefully, knowing her son had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for every black traveler who had ever been told, "Your seat's been reassigned." The narrative had shifted. What began as a single man quietly being removed from his seat had now forced an entire industry to confront its reflection. With the CEO gone and public trust at rock bottom, Airnova's board turned to what they called restorative transformation. But the public wasn't looking for marketing campaigns or glossy inclusion ads. They wanted to see real consequences, measurable, structural, permanent. In response, the airline was forced to open its books. A third-party racial bias audit was launched. Findings revealed decades of discretionary seating practices disproportionately impacting black passengers and other travelers of color, especially on high-visibility international routes. The data was damning. Public hearings followed. Airline executives testified before transportation regulatory bodies. Former employees were called forward to speak on record. The stories were consistent. Policies existed to protect brand optics, and black passengers were routinely subjected to reassignments masked as operational decisions. But for the first time, it wasn't just the victims speaking into a void. The public was listening, and this time, they were demanding more than apologies. A federal aviation task force was formed to investigate discriminatory practices in commercial air travel. Malcolm Reeves' case became the cornerstone, the example lawmakers and activists used to justify sweeping proposals. Airlines began preemptively updating their protocols. Real-time seat reassignments now required justification and digital logs. Algorithms were recoded to eliminate human bias from passenger upgrade lists. Civil rights monitors were invited into industry meetings. The pressure was working. Meanwhile, Malcolm continued his quiet resistance, not through lawsuits or interviews, but through action. He launched a nonprofit, Flight Forward, aimed at protecting travelers from racial discrimination and providing legal resources for those targeted by profiling in transit systems. In its first month, the organization received hundreds of submissions. A single mother denied boarding without cause. a high school debate team separated by staff with no explanation. An elderly man told he was too much trouble to assist with boarding. These weren't isolated cases. They were the symptoms of a deeper problem. Malcolm didn't position himself as the face of a movement. He was never interested in public recognition. But others saw in him what the industry tried to ignore: dignity without spectacle, resistance without chaos. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. He had done more for accountability through quiet, deliberate action than any statement Airnova ever released. Veterans groups that once had token representation in airline commercials now had seats at the boardroom table. Black travelers who had quietly accepted mistreatment for years found their voices again. Travel watchdogs developed bias reporting systems integrated directly into booking apps. It was slow. It wasn't perfect. But it was beginning. And while some critics insisted it was all reactionary, that it wouldn't last, one thing had already changed for good. People were watching. At every gate, on every plane, in every row. And if another Malcolm Reeves were to face that same moment again, someone would be recording. Someone would speak up. Someone would remember that silence is a choice and justice only moves when pushed. The tide hadn't fully turned, but it had shifted. And the weight of that shift was now undeniable. The cameras were off. The headlines had moved on to the next outrage. But in a quiet hospital room just outside London, none of that mattered. Malcolm sat beside his mother's bed, holding her hand as the late afternoon sun broke through the blinds. The same hand that had once packed his school lunches, patched his wounds, and pulled him back to himself after his lowest moments now felt too small, too fragile. She had barely spoken since he arrived, but her eyes said everything. He told her everything he hadn't told the press, not about the lawsuit or the protesters, but about how it had felt to stand at that gate and be treated like he didn't matter, not just as a man, but as her son. He hadn't cried when the airline took his seat, but now in that room, he did. "They tried to make me disappear, Mama. They tried to tell me without saying it that I didn't belong there." She squeezed his hand as tightly as her body would allow. "You showed them who you are." He told her about the thousands of people writing in, stories that sounded so familiar they might as well have been his. People who had suffered quietly, who had accepted it because they didn't think anyone would believe them, and how all it took was one person pressing record for the lie to start unraveling. "This wasn't about a seat," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It never was. He had flown across an ocean not for a courtroom or campaign, but for this moment. Because even after everything, all the noise and interviews and meetings, this was still the only thing that mattered. He needed her to see him, not in uniform, not on a screen, but as her child. The one she'd taught to speak softly but stand firm. The one she told to never let the world teach him shame for being who he was. "I kept my promise," he said. "I came home." A tear slipped from her eye, then another. She turned her head slightly, breathing through the oxygen tube, and with what little strength she had left, she said, "You stood for more than yourself. That's what makes a man." She passed later that evening, peacefully. With the sun still painting the room gold. Malcolm didn't announce it. He didn't post a tribute. He simply went quiet for a while. In the weeks that followed, her funeral became a private ceremony, small, respectful, quiet. But among the guests were people who had never met her, people who had traveled across oceans to be there. Black veterans, airline employees, even a former passenger who'd once been downgraded on a similar flight and never told why. They came to honor her not because of her fame, but because her son had shown the world what grace looks like under fire. And because in her strength, they saw their own mothers, their own elders, their own reasons to keep going. Malcolm carried her folded scarf with him now, tucked into the inner pocket of his jacket. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. That silence can be heavy, but sometimes it's what keeps your feet on the ground. And that every act of dignity, no matter how small, ripples outward in ways we can never fully predict. He had flown to say goodbye, but he left with a promise to never sit quietly again. Months had passed since the video went viral. The headlines had faded, and the outrage that once set the internet ablaze had found new targets. But the story of Malcolm Reeves hadn't been forgotten, not by those who lived it, and certainly not by those it changed. In Washington, a bill titled the Passenger Equity Act was introduced, aimed at mandating transparency in seating assignments, mandatory bias training for airline staff, and establishing an independent body to investigate passenger discrimination claims. It wasn't just symbolic. It was real, and it bore his name. "This is Malcolm's Law," one of the sponsoring lawmakers said from the Senate floor. Not because he asked for it, but because he earned it, by doing what the system couldn't, standing tall with his dignity when everything else tried to strip it away. Malcolm remained grounded. He never returned to first class, not out of fear, but because he knew the fight had never been about that seat. It was about something far older, far heavier. It was about being seen, truly seen, in a system that too often looks away. Through Flight Forward, the nonprofit he founded, dozens of travelers who once sat in silence now had lawyers, advocates, and most importantly, proof. Stories once shrugged off as just a bad experience were now part of a documented pattern, impossible to deny. His story reached farther than he ever intended. A university named a lecture series after him, focused on ethics and public accountability. Veterans associations included his story in training programs about dignity beyond duty. And travel companies began including cultural bias checkpoints in their customer service policies. Still, Malcolm never called himself a hero. He refused interviews from major networks, turned down book deals, and quietly declined an invitation to appear on national television. "I didn't do anything special," he said during a rare public appearance. "I just stood still and refused to let them move me." In a world that rewards spectacle, his quiet resistance hit differently. It reminded people that injustice isn't always loud. It's in the lowered voice, the turned gaze, the way someone says "sir" while pushing you aside. And it reminded them that justice doesn't always come with noise either. Sometimes it looks like staying in your seat, even when the world tries to drag you out of it. Justice, for Malcolm Reeves, wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about winning. It was about truth. The truth that Black veterans, Black travelers, Black fathers, Black sons don't need to prove their worth at every checkpoint. The truth that dignity isn't a reward for good behavior, it's a right. He never got his original seat back, but he made sure no one else would lose theirs without a fight. That, in the end, was the victory. Not loud, not quick, but lasting. Because the moment Malcolm Reeves stood his ground quietly in full view of the world, the system blinked first. Call to action. If this story moved you, don't leave without subscribing to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you've ever faced something like this. Your voice matters. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes justice starts with staying right where you are.